Okay, well, I think it's time to start. Good evening to everyone, and welcome to the next session of the seminar of the Center for Institutional Studies at the HSC University. We are extremely pleased to greet as our speaker tonight, Gayane Vardanyan, a new arrival at the Center for Institutional Studies. She has just resumed her postdoctoral fellowship at our center. Gayane received her Bachelor of Science in Finance from the Armenian State University of Economics in Yerevan. She continued her education in the master's program in Bern, University of Bern, and received her PhD from Trinity College in Dublin. She specializes in economic history and migration studies, and quite appropriately, her talk today combines both. It's about return migration decisions based on evidence from Irish mass migration at the turn of the 20th century. Again, welcome.
Thank you very much, Leonid, and thanks for the opportunity to do a presentation this early in the semester. And hello, everyone. So I'm just going to start sharing the screen and talking about the paper. Right, so let me just give a quick background why I studied this topic and where the idea came from. It's a project that's project of a bigger research question. Let's say I started examining Irish migration at the age of mass migration from Ireland to the States when I started my doctorate thesis. So this is sort of the third main question out of the three that I answered as a part of my thesis project. Right, so the idea of the paper is to see return migration decisions for Irish population at the turn of the 20th century. And let me quickly start why we study this subject, right? So age of mass migration was one of the biggest migration periods in the history that happened, specifically to the States. 30 million people went. I'm not sure if you can see the whole screen, is it looking fine for everyone? Or
it's fine. For me, it's fine.
Yeah, good. So 30 million people went from Europe to the States, and about 1 in 3 returned home eventually, right? So this is a time period that was famous for a lot of people leaving Europe for the States and also for a return, quite high percentage. And what's happening that this is a very interesting historical period for people to analyze migration decisions, but a lot of work is done just concentrating on individual characteristics of these migrants to the States. Let's say, who were these people, from which countries they left, what were the migration rates. Studies such as Bandiera, Bramitsky, and very little work is done specifically on return migration. I mentioned in here 2 main works on return migration in the period of mass migration by Abramitsky on Norwegian return migration and by Alan Fernyhough. This is a recent work, not published yet. It's a working paper that technically looks at Irish case. So this study I started to work on parallel to Alan, and I'll talk about the differences between my work and his work and kind of try to say why this work is also substantial and what's the difference between my work and his work. But the Norwegian migration has been studied by Abramitsky. It's also interesting. So this is the main significant study that has been done on return migration in the age of mass migration. However, Norwegian migration was not that substantial as Irish migration is Italian in terms of numbers. So technically, I believe this study is also interesting because it's studying the country with the highest immigration rate. About 13 out of 1,000 people in the age of mass migration went to the States from Ireland, right? So this is a motivation, background about age of mass migration, why it's interesting to me, and specifically for Irish case, why the States? Obviously, this was a period that a lot of people went to the States, but for Irish migration, migration to the States was a representative of the overall migration, right? So there were major migrant destination countries for Irish people, States, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. as we can see, so probably colors are not that very prominent, but this, the dark blue ones are the ones that represent migration to the States per 1,000 people. And we can see that throughout the whole time period between 1876 till the First World War, the migration to the States was highest as opposed to the other countries. And the peak reached in around 1886, 1890s, that we had around 11 people per 1,000 migrating to the States from Ireland. Right, so the significance of this project comes from the fact that migration to the States, specifically I'll mention later on to Ellis Island, island near New York, is representative of overall Irish migration in the time period that I'm going to look at. So this is Fitzpatrick's analysis on generally Irish migration, which is a little bit more, I could say, descriptive analysis rather than empirical about Irish migration, who were the Irish migrants and to which countries they left for. Now, back to research questions. So that was a sort of motivation, right? Why we look at this subject, and what I'm studying in here, what are the main questions that I address in the paper? Who were returned Irish migrants at the turn of the 20th century, specifically in the time period mentioned between 1892 and 1924? Time period that I chose is both random and non-random, in the sense it's specific time period for which the migration records are available on Ellis Island data, right? So these are the migrant records at individual level that are given on Steve Morris's website, where we got a data set from for Ellis Island. Next question, so the first one, who were they in terms of individual characteristics? What were their age, marital status, so on, whatever we can tackle based on census information that I will talk about it later on. A second question, what's the lower bound of Irish return migration rate in this period? So a little bit clarification what we mean by lower bound. Some studies, as I said, analyze generally return migration at the age of mass migration, right? So they, for example, Bandiera is conducting comprehensive analysis. She with her co-authors, they take United States Census records and they try to estimate the out-migration rate from the States to the specific European countries. But for their analysis, it's more about out-migration rates. So technically, who left USA, what percentage of, let's say, German people who migrated to the States, what percentage of them left out-migrating. For us, we try kind of to measure the specific rate of return, meaning that what percentage of people came back to Ireland. Lower bound we identify because the percentage that I'm finding in here are the lowest possible that has been found in the literature for Irish out-migration in the period for the States. And also, I believe it gives the lower rate because of the way I'm constructing data sets, right? So I'm applying certain matching techniques of historical records, and obviously these techniques are made in a way that somehow they result in a very low rate of return as opposed to what is done in literature. Right, how were the migrants selected from the migrant pool, non-migrant populations? Technically just the selection, which is a common question, and also for Norwegian case, they studied the selection of migrants from the rest of the population. So these are the main questions. About contribution. So I already kind of gave motivation why we look at this question, but contribution is interesting, right? So first part, contributing to the emerging literature on return migration within the age of mass migration. Is already talked about it. The only prominent paper is by Abramitsky on Norwegian migration. Adding findings to recent study. This second one is, as I said, so is a recent paper. It's a working paper by UCD professors in Ireland, Vardanyan and Ograda. So they're analyzing return migration for Irish case. They started this study last year, but their study is concentrated on comparing certain samples of Irish census with the US Census records, whereas in here we're applying Ellis Island records, we have a different data. The data is a little different, it's richer, and it's based on identification of returnees by matching the records. Right, so this is contributing to their study. So we'll talk about differences in later on when we get some more robust conclusions in that sense. Third contribution, we find return migration rate, lower bound of return migration rate as opposed to very high out migration rates found by Bandiera. So according to Bandiera, based on US Census records, they find that about between 74 and 93% of Irish people come back, not come back, but leave USA. And I think somehow in their work, they show that they go first to Britain, and then we wouldn't know whether they come to Ireland. They don't. So in their analysis, it's more about people who left rather than who returned to Ireland, right? Who left from the States. Another contribution is that we follow Dylan Connor's work. So Connor is analyzing Irish mass migration using granular level data. So I could say this is a second study of Connor that looks at Irish mass migration utilizing this level of micro level data, right? And for him, he's also applying Ellis Island records. He's looking at male population only. In here, I tried to do the analysis partially for women as well. And for his case, he concentrates more on the individual characteristics of Irish migration, also proves that migrant networks play an important role for people to go to the States. So in this case, we answer more about return rather than about those who leave. Okay, some historical background. So general historical background about migration to Ellis Island, why this is interesting again, and migration, about Irish migration in general. In 1892, historical migration started to Ellis Island. So United States maintained an open border policy. We'll know this is a period when US started to attract a lot of Europeans. For Irish case, there were about 800,000 people who left. And actually, I didn't mention it in here, but the first person who left for the States was an Irish girl, young Irish girl, Aoife, I can't recall surname, a 16-year-old, I believe, with her brother. And the first migrant, so technically, who left was an Irish. The highest group of migrants were obviously Italians, and after the earthquake and everything happened in Italy, but Ireland is the second largest for specific this period, right? So for the entire mass migration period, Ireland is the first one. Why Ellis Island migration was this prominent, and why a lot of people left, apart from the fact that Europe was experiencing, certain countries in Europe were experiencing lower level of wages as opposed to the States, but also in this period, there was a shift from sail to steam technology. So technically the movement to the States became cheaper. There was motivation for people to live more because it was easier for them to move. And also to return as well, right? That's why we also had a higher return rate in this period because of lower costs of travel. A little background again, how Irish immigration started. So it's not that Ireland started to migrate to the States in this period. I also talk about the fact that from around 1875, we saw very high migration rates to the States, but also could say that this migration from Ireland started way back in 1600s, where 25,000 Catholics left to the States and to Britain as well. But very high rates of migration started just the first quarter of the 19th century, which was somehow related to the changes in Irish industrial sector. So a lot of people left to Canada and the States for the hope of finding some sort of possibilities in the industrial sector in the States, because Ireland was experiencing a low level of industrialization in this time period. Right, but apart from the fact that in 30-year time period, we have about 1 million people living, we can see that within the next 5 years, another 1 million Irish people left. And definitely this was a phenomenon that was somehow explained by some exogenous shock, by specifically Irish famine. So that's a different topic for research in my another paper with my co-authors. But then this rate started to decrease in about 1860s, because after famine, obviously living standards in Ireland, they decreased, but from about 1860s, Ireland started to experience wage convergence, and its wages started to be reaching in the industrial sector the same level as they were in the States. So people started to migrate less and to search for industrialization or job in the industry sector in Ireland as opposed to the States. So what we see is that although the migration rates decreased from around 15 people per thousand and they reached about 8 per thousand just before the First World War, so there was about twice decrease in the emigration rate, but still this was the second highest emigration rate from Europe to the States after Italy at the turn of the 20th century. Right, so this is a technical background, technically some data background on migration numbers to Ellis Island. Now back to paper. What I'm doing in here, I'm utilizing 3 historical data sets. All of them are large data sets. So it's 1901 and 1911 Irish Census records, Ellis Island administrative records on Irish migrants, about 500,000. Initially I said 800,000, but then a lot of migrants didn't report their age, their county of residence, which are key for analysis. So I dropped them, and I lost some nice percentage of population, but this is what we have. So now with the about the data, I did not put the summary statistics for each data set just because of time constraint, but about data is what they include. 1901, 1911 censuses, this include individual level information, individual characteristics of people, name, age, county of residence, their gender, marital status, occupation, religion, literacy, country or county of birth. And census also report household level data. They report the type of the houses people have, the quality of the dwellings, so things that are not relevant to the analysis. I just didn't include it in here. Right, and Ellis Island records, it's more about people's migratory behavior. So who were the migrants? Again, their name, age, last county of residence before they left Ireland, gender, marital status when leaving Ireland, port of departure, name of vessel, and date of arrival to the States. So the common variables I mentioned with the blue, that both the datas report. And now I'm going to try to give some summarizations. This slide is a little filled with words, so I'll try to keep it shorter and simpler. What's the goal? Goal is to find the characteristics of migrants and subsequently characteristics of returned migrants that were present in Ellis Island records in the censuses, right? So first task I do have in here is to be able to find the names of these people in one of the censuses. I'll talk about it in which one I choose, and to identify who were the people who returned back. First thing first, so what I do, I differentiate between samples of male migrants and single women. So for all data sets for 1901, 1911 census, and for Ellis Island records, I separate people, I separate male population and single women, specifically single women because in Ireland, women tended to change their surnames when get married. So for matching, it's kind of hard to match them because of that. I drop basically population who is married. Right, and matching strategy is similar to Abramitsky's paper in the sense of the way the matching is done. First I do, I match individuals across the 2 censuses, 1901 and 1911. So this is the same across 2 genders. Matching is done based on name, surname, age, and county of birth. And I take the master data set as 1911 census, and I try to identify migrants and return migrants based on the 1911 census. Why I utilize 1911 census as well? Because I understand that I can have a sample of population, sample of migrants who are present in both censuses, and thus I can find the characteristics of some returned migrants before they left Ireland. So if I take 1911 as the master data set for identifying returnees, then if I find their names again in 1901, this will be giving me information of their characteristics before they left Ireland. So in here, I match this generated sample of censuses, which is technically the entire 1911 census, and added with the characteristics of some sample of population who are from the 1901 census. I match this this sample with Ellis Island records, and this time I match based on name, surname, age, and last county of residence, because I don't have county of birth in Ellis Island records, unfortunately. So matching can be a little controversial in that sense as well, because county of residence can be changed within certain period of time from, let's say, this period till 1911. But that's no, kind of, I don't have any choice, because if I exclude this, matching will go with more false positives rather than if I include this and I have a little more, let's say, false negative matches. Right, identification of returnees. So how do I define returnees? People who left before 1911, let's say, who migrated between 1892 and 1910, and who are matched with the 1911 census are returnees, right? If someone left Ireland in 1907, and if they are in the 1911 Irish census, then that means they return back. In here, of course, I make use of the assumption that migrants tend to return to the counties that they originally left from. So this can somehow bias my results, because a lot of cases we can see people come back, maybe they shift their counties. But returning to county of origin is typical to migrants, as stated in migrant literature by King, by Gmer. So these papers show that in a lot of cases, maybe majority of migrants tend to return to their homeland and specific regions that they were left originally from. Right, match rates. So this is just a quick recap to understand where we are and where the data matching is relevant to the literature. I didn't mention in here quite correctly, like, about the literature, but what I have about match rates is census match rates for male population is 26%, for single women it's 17%. Then when I match censuses with Ellis Island records, I have 19% for male population respectively, 14 for single women. So this is about the data matching results. It's in line with literature by Ferry, by Abramitsky, who have around 15 to 21% of match rates. Okay, what is this thing in here? This is percentage of matched returnees. So if I look at the original population of migrants who left before 1911, let's say who left between 1892 and 1910, and whose name is in the 1911 Irish census, then the percentage of those people that I find in the 1911 census compared to the entire sample of people who left between 1892 and 1910, I'm able to find 11% of men in the 1911 census and 7% of women in the 1911 census. Right, so matching rates, I assume that people who return are not that very high, so that's why we're having lower bound of return rate for Irish case. Return migrants. And now, first question, my identifying characteristics of return migrants based on the 1911 Irish census. Who are these people? Right, the goal, first goal we met, we found return rate 11% for men, 7% for single women. Who are these people, right? If we look at the 1911 census, the results, we can see from the 1911 census that about 1.4% of the people in the census of male population are returnees, and about 1.16% of the census population are women, and they are returnee and they are single. The records show that men who are returning in 1911, they are 33-year-old on average. Women are 29-year-old, whereas at the moment of leaving Ireland, they were 25-year-old and 21-year-old respectively. So technically, I can see that on average, the maximum amount of the time that they stayed in the States is more or less 8 years. And that's also proven by another characteristics that we have in here. This variable year of migration is a year when people left Ireland, and this is from Ellis Island records. So on average, they left in 1903 and women left in 1904, meaning that they are found in 1911 census, meaning that they stayed in the US maximum for 7 to 8 years. Individual characteristics, people who returned, after returning, they, about 53% of them are engaged in agriculture of men, and about 33% of women are engaged in service sector. This is maybe also not saying much, in the sense that even if we look at the census population, we can see that majority of men are engaged in agriculture, majority of women in service sector. But also the next table will give us more information about whether this, for a certain percentage of people, maybe there was shift in their occupation before they left and they came, after they came back. Right, so this is just a summary statistics, nothing in terms of causation or some explanation of why they return. Now, this is sample of return migrants. So why again I utilized 1901 census? Because I wanted to see that there is a sample of people who are returning in to Ireland and whose name is in 1911 census, but whose name is also in the 1901 census. For the sample of the people who are in both censuses, I can identify pre- and post-migration characteristics. The goal of this table is technically to see that the characteristics didn't change much, right? Obviously, age is changing, but literacy rate, the capacity of speaking Irish, their religion, and the marital state, the religion, sorry, didn't experience much changes. So this, before they went to the States, after they came back, they had pretty much same characteristics. Apart from marital status, some men tended to be single before leaving, and upon returning within that 7 year of time, the percentage of men who got married increased about, I could say, about 3 times. Right? For women, I don't have that because this is single women, so marital status is 0 for both cases. Somehow, this is showing that marital status can be somehow explanatory for why male migrants tended to return. This can give a hint that marriage was one of the reasons. Occupation-wise, what we have, again, we see not much differences in terms of average numbers for men and for women. So for men, major occupation is agriculture, and production for women, it's the production in here and service sector. Just one difference, I can say that percentage of women who work in service sector more than doubles between the 10-year period of time. So before they left and after they came back, I see that more women tend to engage in service and more women tend to engage in production. Interesting graphs. I think this is an interesting thing to look at. So return migration rate in Irish counties, again, differentiating between men and women. On the left, we have the male return migration rate. On the right, we have female return migration rate. In terms of numbers, not quite sure it's visible, but the lighter the color, obviously, the less is the return rates. The highest return rate is about an average 3% for men, and on average it's about 2.7, 2.8 for women. And we obviously see that the higher a return is coming in here with from the graphs from the southern counties, Kerry and Cork in here, western counties, Clare, southern counties in Mayo, so southern counties, southern western counties are having higher return rate. For women, it's also Donegal, which is the northern county. I'll talk about it, why I think that's the case. Again, interesting fact to observe. I don't have the graphs of initial Irish migration to the States. This is about return migration, but interesting fact to observe is that there was also a very high level of migration from these southern and southwestern countries in the period of famine, as well as in this time period that we're looking at. So return is consistent to be high from the counties where people left from. And in here, we're talking not about absolute numbers, but about ratio, meaning to be the ratio between number of return migrants over county population in 1911. Okay, so can I ask how much time I have, Bernardo, for talk?
So usually it's like 45 minutes. So if you finish like by around 7, that's fine. So let's say 20 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And please, if you have any questions or I'm talking too fast, you interrupt me. Or
Okay, thanks.
ask.
No, but please, it's fine as now, I think.
Perfect. Thank you. So econometric specifications in here are very simple yet very similar to the literature. So I choose my strategy to be similar to Abramitsky's strategy about selection. I tried to measure the selection for return migrants, specifically for male migrants. For a reason I will tell why I can't proceed with female migrants with the analysis for now, although I did the data work on that. So the idea is to see how different were returned migrants compared to the non-migrant population in 1911 after they returned, and also compare them to the permanent migrants before leaving Ireland in 1901. So there's two different steps in the econometrics part. Estimating equation in that sense, we're trying to measure the change in the occupational sectors, so in the occupational groups for returnees, and to see whether being a return migrant resulted in a higher or a lower occupational people. We technically do it in two steps. First one, if we take 1911, we compare the occupation of returned migrants with the occupation of non-migrants after they returned, and on the other hand, we compare the occupational subcategories of returned migrants to the occupational subcategories of permanent migrants before they left Ireland. So what we do, we create subcategories of occupation within occupational groups, giving it 1 to an individual who belongs to a higher skilled occupation and 0 for an individual who belongs to a lower skilled occupation. And I conduct that for 3 different groups of occupation: for agricultural occupation, for production, and for professional occupations. What's the similarity of the strategy with the strategy of Abramitsky? So what they do for them, the independent, the dependent variable, instead of in here, as I have the YIT, they have the log of occupation-based earnings. So they technically try to measure whether for returnees there was an increase in their occupation-based earnings after they came back compared to the non-migrants. But instead of occupation-based earnings, I'm using the upgrading of their occupational categories. Why am I doing that? Just because I don't have a data on their wages. For Irish case, we have a lack of data. I believe there should be some data on earnings in production sector, but that's not completely online available yet for now. How do I create the categories? So I'm estimating in here with a linear probability model. I choose to look at the 3 occupational categories with a simple reason, because in these occupations, I can identify which is a higher skilled occupation and which is a lower skilled occupation, right? So if a person is working in agriculture, he's a farmer, or he's in a family of a farmer, his father is farmer, his brother is farmer, that occupational category is a higher category, so it's equal to 1. And the other occupations in agriculture, which in census are reported, are mainly like general laborer or a servant of a farmer. This I denoted with a 0. In production sector, what we have in census is we have general laborer, and on the other hand, we have occupations like grazer, like a person who is working in the shoe sector, who is owning a shoe production, and so on. So we can see that the general laborer, as confirmed by archives, is considered as a lower skilled occupation as opposed to other ones. So here I kind of have 0 for general labor and 1 for the rest of the occupations. And for professional occupations, it is a little hard, but I just kind of work on the fact that teachers and schoolmasters are tended to be more highly qualified and in a higher ladder of literacy as opposed to other professionals in the census. Of course, certain professionals such as maybe doctors and nurses, they're creating some bias. So these results are confirmed with excluding those professions as well. And just to make sure that the variable is valid for showing the higher skilled occupation. Right, so the statistically significant coefficients show that, so this is return migrants versus non-migrants, show that, let's say, a return migrant after returning to Ireland is more likely to become a farmer, or to have a farm, to own a farm, or to be related to a family member who owns a farm, let's say to work for his father, as opposed to the people who never left Ireland. As well in here, the other 2 coefficients are significant. They are not significant when I include location dummies. So for production and for professionals, the results are statistically significant when I don't consider location variables. Right, so this shows some significance for like positive selection for returnees as opposed to the rest of the population. And when I look at the results for return migrants versus permanent migrants before leaving Ireland, so in 1901, results are not that interesting. They're just not significant, right? I don't find any characteristical differences within occupational categories for migrants who return as opposed to those who did not return before leaving Ireland. So before leaving Ireland, I'm saying that there was no skill-based occupational difference in the migrant pool of Irish migrants. Yeah, here I forgot to talk about the fact that marital status is also coefficient is significant for agricultural occupations in here. So people who tend to return more often married, they more often become farmers, and these ones who, although upgrade their occupations in production, are less often married. So where like single people maybe upgrade their occupation in production, whereas married upgrade in agriculture. And same is happening with professionals. Those who are in professional occupations are more often single. Right. These are the preliminary results, but before concluding, I have 2-3 slides. I have still 10 minutes here on return decisions of Irish people. So, what are these results about? How they can expand the analysis and how they can technically give us more interesting questions to answer. Right, about return decisions. So, why people tend to return? I mentioned 2 or 3 works before, about from Abramitsky, from Fernyhough. There is not much, let's say, empirical work done, but a paper by Falcon, for example, shows that a fieldwork in 1975 shows that in the west of Ireland, people tended to return because of the difficulties of adjusting abroad, because they wanted to get married, and men tended to return because they wanted to inherit property or to assist their families. This is about people in 1975, so it's not our period, but it's just an interesting comparison for return reasons for Ireland in the 20th century. If we look at Gmelch, Whelan, and Hughes, and so these authors show that despite the normal, let's say, materialistic reasons or personal reasons, there can be also psychological reasons why people come back, right? So to be with their friends, to be near their family, and this is another reason which is kind of hard to empirically identify. Finally, Fernyhough and Ograda recent study that I talk about, they find positive selection for returnees in terms of skills and literacy as opposed to the people who never left. So for them, they utilize small samples of US Census records, and they focus on selection based on literacy and skill upgrading, the thing that we couldn't do in our analysis, but we took occupation as an identifier of increase in skills or skill and literacy, if you can define it like that. Right, so this is the background of how to mimic or how to think about possible return mechanisms for Irish. What I observe, I have an interesting, let's say, interesting evidence from history that people, so in Ireland there were land acts, several land acts, to be brief, between 1869 and 1934, and this allowed people who were tenants of certain land holdings to own them, to buy them legally, and these were belonging to the states. In about 1907, there was the final Land Act, which kind of made the land purchase compulsory. So if you're a tenant in Ireland for a certain piece of land and only for a certain long period of time, and you're kind of obliged to buy the land or to sell that. What's happening is that the effectiveness in these programs resulted in a lot of farmers becoming the owners of their own land. And if we look at this paper, at this graphs that I took from the British parliamentary papers of 1908 and 1921, it shows that, so this darker colors that are blue and somehow resembling blue is a higher rate of land holdings, whereas the greener ones are the lower. So we can see that technically in all over the Ireland, the percentage of landholders increased pretty much from 1906 till 1917 specifically. If you look at the counties where we had higher return rate, if you remember previous graphs in here, the southern counties and southwestern counties, and we look in here, they experienced very high increase in terms of land holdings in this time period. So let's say the highest ones, 74.6 till 89.5% in here with the Mayo. And Mayo before was having only about 15, between 15 and 20% of landowners. Right, so we see that you can see the same for Limerick, for example, for Kerry. These are the counties with very sharp increase in percentage of land holdings. So the counties that had higher rate of return migration, they also had higher increase in the percentage of landowners between 11-year time period. So this is nice evidence because it can give us an idea that if we are able to tackle certain information on land purchases, which I kind of tried to do with the land registry in Ireland, but the records are on, you have to buy them, and it's very hard to buy them because they're very expensive. But you can somehow explain the reason, let's say, why men tend to return more often, maybe because they wanted to invest in land and buy their land. And that is also explaining the result that we found in here of that men tended to return, married men, and tended to become farmer more often. So probably buying a farm was one of that reasons for them. Now to conclude, I think I'm being on time. So to conclude and to talk about maybe future possibilities of the paper, what are the main conclusions? I can say that in terms of individual characteristics, I find that average return migrant was young. I remember the age was about 21 for women, 25 for men. Single for men, of course. For women, I didn't look at married ones. Literate at the moment of migrating. And male migrants were more often from agriculture sector. Female migrants were from service sector. And returnees were more often from western and southwestern counties in Ireland, which experienced also high increase in the percentage of land ownership. Percentage-wise, only 11% of male and 7% of female migrants returned home on average within 8-year period of time of their departure. So this is also giving some scope of analysis that maybe, because 8 years is not a very short time period, probably they went also, they did some savings in the States and they came back and they invested in land and they purchased land as one of the reasons for return. And the final one, I find positive selection for occupational categories for return migrants working in agricultural sector. Here mentioned professional as well, though the coefficient for this one is not pretty significant, but for agriculture we have more prominent evidence as opposed to non-migrants, and in the end we don't find any differences between characteristics of return migrants as opposed to migrants who left who left and who didn't come back before leaving Ireland. Okay, so thank you very much. That's all for.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Gayane, for an interesting presentation, also for staying on time.
Thank you very much.
Questions, comments, please.
I have one clarification historical question.
Sure.
I'm sorry if within the question I made some historical mistakes, but like my British history is not so good.
Okay.
So if I understand correctly, like in the period that you studied, like mostly Ireland was officially part of the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland.
Yeah.
So in that sense, like a person who would go from Ireland to the US and in the census, would they say that, oh, I come from Ireland, or would they say, oh, I come from this United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland? Like how I was recorded in the census.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, because about that also, that creates some bias on why we say people more often go to the States rather than Britain, because Britain is sort of mixed with Ireland. The term is mixed in that sense. So what happens in the records, they identify the port of departure, right? So they write, let's say I left from Liverpool or I left from Newcastle, but then they write their nationality as an Irish. So the records are collected based on how you define your nationality as an Irish, right? Of course, state boundaries are the things that can make difficulties for them. But when you look at the Ellis Island records, it's all given by nationality. If you identify yourself as an Irish, then you're considered as an Irish migrant. These are from passenger records that are based on passports. So it's more defined as a Republic of Ireland based on the nationality.
Okay, yeah, I was asking because at least like I don't know, nowadays depending on which part of the UK you are, some people would say British, or some people would say no, I'm English. Like those who are like say pro Brexit would clearly define themselves as English. So like I have this question on like
that's
how would you record yourself?
Yeah, you're right. That time, no, people wouldn't say English, like England was England, but yeah, they would call some of them called British. But in terms of, I think those who are born in Ireland, they would write I'm Irish, and people would take it as an answer in the census, right? So registered within the territory of Irish 32 counties is what comes as an answer in the census why to identify them as Irish.
Okay, so a follow-up question. So, I mean, this is not like central part of your study, but like, do you see any substantial differences between what is now the Republic of Ireland versus Northern Ireland?
Currently?
Like in your results, like I think that you mentioned that there was like some specific stuff more happening in the south or southwest of provinces of Ireland.
Oh no, that was more about migration. In terms of people living, they were living more from south and southwest than from north in that time period. I think differences, if we talk about current differences, Northern Ireland is more like British type as culture-wise, as the way people live. Maybe it's closer to London, to England rather than to Ireland. It's more like British in terms of mentality. Religion-wise as well, maybe there are definitely more Protestants in northern population. In that period that I looked at, Northern Ireland was again more industrialized. So northern counties were far better in industrial sector, and I think that's a reason people tended to migrate less from Northern Ireland, because they had jobs like in Belfast and in Derry. They were more secure and they didn't need to go to the States to find industrial jobs, whereas West and Southwest were lacking that, were more good in agriculture. So that was the reason people left from Southwest and West more often than from the North. I think key difference in characteristical features is that South and Southwest of Ireland were more agriculture-based and North were more production-based in that time period. And now, of course, as well, Belfast, I believe, is more industrialized, although Dublin is experiencing a lot of growth recently, but still it's more British. Industrialization is still more prominent in there than in our republic.
Thanks.
Just a curiosity.
Please.
Yes.
Anyone? Timur, or?
Yes, I have two questions.
Paolo also has a question.
Yeah, but I will.
I'm sorry, Paolo. So
no problem. Go on, Timur. Go on.
Timur,
yes,
please
yes.
go ahead.
So my first question is about just technical clarification questions about the classification of your return migrants. So you, if I'm correct, so you classify farmers as a low-skilled occupation mostly, right?
No, the other way around.
So sorry.
So farm owner is a higher skilled in agriculture as opposed to general worker in agriculture.
Oh, so yes, that was my actual clarification question. So farm owners were mostly high skill in your classification, and farm laborers were low skill. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And my second question is mostly about like more general significance of the results. So can we interpret those as migration rises the human capital of those who decided to return? So they migrated, acquired some skills, knowledge, and some savings as well, and then returned to be farm owners rather than simple laborers. So can we interpret those results as well? And how do, if yes, and how do they fit with other literature on contemporary migrations?
For now, unfortunately, we can't completely interpret that it's a skilled-based rise in occupation-based data that we have. So the data currently just says that there was a rise in agricultural occupational settings, that people tend to become more often farmers, but in terms of human capital and whether they had higher skills acquired in the States or whether they tended to save in the States is exactly the next step, and I think it's the scope of the research. If you use US Census records, which I would like to use, and in there you have information of sorry, occupational settings of these people in the States. So I can see maybe a person who was a general laborer in Ireland at that time, then became a farmer, what he was doing in the States, right? Maybe in the States, the same person worked in production or acquired different skills and used these skills, he came and became a farmer. Or else savings data was available, savings banks data by Cormac O'Grada, but for famine periods. So for this specific period, I didn't get that. Could you try it? Sorry. For this specific period, there is no saving data in terms of individual savings. But I think what can be done is to look at the increase in the skills level using the US Census records, and that can explain the result better. For now, the result is just about proof that we see in evidence that there was an increase in the occupational setup, which is more likely to be skill-based, but not proven yet completely.
Thank you.
Okay, Paola, please.
Thank you for the presentation. Just a curiosity, I'm absolutely ignorant about the topic, so it's really a simple curiosity. From your result, it seems that people working in the agriculture are those, at least male working in the agriculture, are the larger group who are back to the native country. So could it be that, so do you have any way to control for income, time load, and working condition? Because one reason to be back could be that they can have some comparative advantage in having the same work, not in the US, but in Ireland. So, and this could be obviously interesting because it is somehow it will select accordingly to what they do in the US. So what they move to do in the US somehow will predict you, at least with some probability, who is back and who will remain in the US. And this could be very much related to the income level, the time load, the working condition, which obviously will affect very much the daily life.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Paul, for the question. It's a great question. So for that, again, to answer is maybe two different angles of answer I can give. First one, whether the what was their income in the States, right? Or maybe what was their occupation. This is something US Census data gives as answers. So publicly available samples are available from around 1840s for Irish people till 1900 in there. If we manage to find these people who are in Ellis Island records, in the census records in the States, then I can see their income, occupation-based income in the States, and then I can see maybe they had higher income there, and that's not the reason they returned, or if they had a lower income there, maybe they had better opportunities in Ireland. So that's an excellent point for the next step of the paper. But honestly, to believe in that, I think that for agricultural people at least, definitely they wouldn't have better income in the States in terms of agriculture, because in this period they mostly left for the States because of better industrialization in there. So the ones who tended to return were exactly working in agricultural sector. And a reason could be that Ireland gave them better opportunities, right, in terms of owning their land, and also the famine has been passed already, and agricultural conditions were better in Ireland. But again, as it's not 100% proven, I don't have empirics to confirm that. I'll try to use US Census records, because for this period, for Irish people, we don't have their earnings in Ireland, but we can have some information on their earnings and occupations in the States. So, so that's a very, very good point. Thank
Okay,
you.
please, anyone else?
Thank you.
May I ask a question again?
Sure.
It's to follow on what Timur asked. Timur asked whether there is some evidence that people brought back from the US to Ireland
Yeah.
some additional human capital. My question would be to see if there is any evidence that these people had brought back to Ireland some new views, attitudes, some norms, social capital, if you will, because that was essentially a significant treatment. Lots of people had come back from a different country, different culture. And can we trace any impact of this treatment in later developments events, such as movement for independence during the First World War, or maybe the Civil War in Ireland, or whatever else, because you have a fine-grained data set, so you can differentiate the intensity of return migration between counties and other localities. So it might be worthwhile to see. That question actually was brought back to some extent by a paper by Samit Raja, who presented before you. And he showed that that the Indians that were coming back from the Second World War after having spent time in the British Army have made significant differences in what happened in their home country after their return. So they learned some skills, some not just skills, but they had been transformed by their participation in the war, and that transformation was visible in what happened in India and Pakistan in the late 1940s. So maybe you can at least think about doing something similar in Ireland as well. Identification would not be obvious, of course, because there are so many confounding variables and endogeneity looms large, but still it's something that might be worthwhile discussing.
Yeah, I thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, because what we see is return rates are pretty high just before the First World War and before Irish independence that happened in 1916, officially in 1920 later on. I trust to maybe the logic that as proven by literature, there was high level of assimilation of European migrants in the States, and including Irish migrants. So Irish people tended to assimilate to the States quicker, if you want to say it, as opposed to lots of European nationalities. And evidence of that to be the fact that Irish people started to have almost the same wages as US people just about 2-3 years after they arrived in the States, which kind of confirms that they most likely upgraded their skills and maybe work skills in terms of professional skills, but also social skills as well. Assimilation is a proof that there was a skill increase, I believe, for Irish case, but how it was reflected in their decision to return, maybe they got more connected to their families in the States, right? Because we have an evidence in another paper that I wrote with my co-authors that they left for the States because of migrant networks that were generated in the famine period. So it could be the case that their friends and families who had better position in the States sort of affected the uprising of their skills and their occupations in the States, and based on that, maybe it changed their mindset that they can return home to make their home more a better place to live in, right? A migrant network can be an effect, the simulation can be an indirect effect of their uprising, of social skills and social norms. But again, you're right that it's empirically not very trivial, and it's very worth to look at that. But for now, I don't have the complete answer to that question. But
I guess, if I may, the US at that time was obviously a freer, more democratic society than was Ireland. So the people that have come back, they had been exposed to some more functional democracy and political competition and so on. So would that make them more likely to become political leaders or activists or back home? That would be interesting to see.
Yeah, that's a very nice one. Sure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, well, please, other questions, other comments? Timur, you have?
Yes, I have one more.
Sure.
So, as far as I know, do you have surnames in the Ellis Island data?
Yes.
Yes, and could they be linked to Irish censuses as well? So my hypothesis would be that a decision to return would probably depend on the size of the family, of the extended family. I think Abramsky has pointed out that for families with more household members, they were more attractive for returning decision to make. So I wonder if it's possible to test this idea. Yeah.
With more household members in Ireland, meaning?
Yes, in Ireland, which could be proxied by the number of people with a certain surname.
Yeah, definitely. That can be done. The results already show that the people who tend to return are from the region that had a higher density of migrants in the previous period. So I kind of think that they return in couples. That I can probably tackle based on the fact that they tend to return together. But also to tackle how many people there were in Ireland, that's also very possible, because I have a number of household members in the household level. I can construct a household level analysis. It's a very nice point to.
I think you can just calculate the measure of attractiveness for return migration.
Perfect. Based